Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining this Sprintax informational session. Everything you need to know about non-resident tax for international students and scholars of University of Pennsylvania. My name is Ryan Ludden. I am from the Sprintax team, and today we're going to be walking you through the ins and outs of your tax obligations for this filing season. On the back end, we also have Carl Salzberg from the Penn payroll office and tax office, and also from our side, we've got Anna Fitzpatrick on the back end, who will be happy to see questions that might come through the chat box along the way. Great. So just before we kick off, just some general housekeeping. You will notice this session is muted on your end. It's so that we've got a good copy and good audio for the recording that will be shared with the Penn team. You will be able to add, there is a questions tab where you can pop in any queries that are on your mind around your tax obligations. What I might ask there is, usually we cover a lot of those topics along the journey. So maybe wait until later on in the session to start asking those questions, as we might cover those topics over the next couple of slides ahead. And then with all things taxes, there's usually always a disclaimer tagged onto it. I always say tax is a little bit like your own DNA, in that it might seem like Ryan and Anna are very much the same on paper, could be studying the same program from the same home country, but for one small detail, they could be treated differently for tax purposes. So do keep that in mind as we go throughout this session. Alrighty, so what are we going to talk about today? We will talk about a general overview of tax principles for international students and scholars. Topics like who needs to file a tax return, residency purposes, state tax filing, important dates for the year, and much, much more under that umbrella. We'll then talk about the implications of forgetting to file a tax return for prior years, or maybe what to do if you filed incorrectly in the past. We'll then move into how you can use the Sprintax returns software to prepare your end of year tax returns. Many of you might have seen invitations to what's called Sprintax Calculus, which is a separate software which helps the payroll and tax office to understand your tax position and issue 1042-S forms. But we'll talk about those differences a little later so that you're clear on the difference between calculus and returns for this tax season. And then we'll leave time for Q&A at the end. Alrighty, so the important dates for 2024. Whilst we're sitting here in 2025, we're actually looking back at everything that's happened between January 1st through to December 31st, 2024. So all of the time that you spent on US soil during that period, all of the US source income that you earned during that period of time is what we'll be concerned about when we're filing your US tax return for this season. And the deadline to file your federal tax return with the IRS, which are the federal tax authorities, is Tuesday, April 15th, 2025. So the next topic is residency for tax purposes. And this can confuse quite a lot of international students and scholars. I can see why, but hopefully this slide will help to break down the concept of tax residency. And generally, most international students and scholars who are on their F, J, M, or Q visas are considered a non-resident for tax purposes for a set period of time. Now, if you are wondering what on earth does a non-resident for tax purposes mean, very simply put, it means different tax rules will apply to you than your fellow American roommates or work colleagues or other residents for tax purposes. And you also need to file different tax forms than your American or resident colleagues and friends as well. Now, if you are an international student on a J1 and F1 student visa, you're automatically considered a non-resident for tax purposes for 5 calendar years in the US. It's important to note that these years don't need to be consecutive. It's a lifetime rule, and you don't need to be present for the entire year for one of these years to be counted. So if Ryan landed at UPenn on December 30th, 2024, that would be one of his years going towards this 5-year rule. For scholars or researchers, professors, and dependents on J visas, you're automatically considered non-resident for tax for 2 tax years. Once you're in your 3rd year in that position, or if you're in your 6th year for a J1 or F1 student, your days then start counting towards what's called the substantial presence test. It sounds like some crazy science experiment, but it generally will start counting all of your days of presence in that 6th or 3rd year, depending if you're a student or a scholar. And if your presence is more than 183 days, you'll be deemed substantially present and considered a resident for US tax purposes. The good news here is that the Sprintax software will do this thinking for you, so you won't need to worry about getting the calculator out. Once we get your visits in and out of the US, your immigration status history will confirm your residency for tax purposes. So I'm going to launch my first poll here, and let me hit launch here. Before we jump into our next topic, I'd like to hear a little bit more about you. And who do you think needs to file tax documents to the IRS as a non-resident? Do you think everyone needs to file something regardless of income? Do you think only those who earned US income need to file? Maybe you think non-residents don't have to file any documents, or maybe you're unsure, and that's okay as well. Great, we've got lots of early votes coming in here. Love to see it. Looks like lots of you are paying attention as well, which is great. Alrighty, let's share the results. Well done. 73% of you were indeed correct. All non-residents need to file something regardless of income. Even if you were just present in the US during 2024, everyone needs to do something as a non-resident. And that leads nicely into this slide. Who must file for 2024? The golden question. Simply put, every non-resident who is an exempt individual must complete Form 8843, regardless of whether or not you earned any US source income. So I'll talk about that form in the next slide. If you earned any taxable US income, so anything over $0 of US income that you earned in 2024, as a non-resident, you will trigger a federal tax filing obligation, which is the 1040 NR form. That's the federal tax return form. So, Form 8843, a statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. It sounds confusing, I know, but it's a simple tax form, but it's basically a declaration of non-resident status to the IRS. If you remember back to the residency slide we talked about earlier, we talked about your 5-year rule where you're exempt from counting your days towards a substantial presence test. So in that case, you're an exempt individual. And that is what this form helps to confirm. So it basically says, hey, my name is Ryan. I'm an F1 student here at UPenn. From France. Here's some details about me. Please don't count my days of presence in the US, as I'm still a non-resident for tax purposes. I'm still exempt from counting these days towards that substantial presence test. Now, the good news here is if you just need to file Form 8843 alone, you don't need a social security number or an ITIN to just file Form 8843 by itself. Now, I'm sure many of you on this call have been receiving US income during 2024. And I suppose when we think about US income, the first thing that comes to mind is employment income, right? Maybe you're on-campus job at UPenn, or maybe you were out on OPT or an internship with an employer outside of the university. This employment income that you receive from a US employer is going to trigger a tax reporting requirement. However, many of you might not think about other forms of US income. And the next one is a taxable scholarship. So a scholarship that covers your tuition and tuition-related expenses, like mandatory books, those are non-taxable and non-reportable in most cases. But if your scholarship covers costs that are not directly related to tuition, for example, a stipend, a grant, award, room and board allowance, these are generally taxable and they're reportable on an income document called the 1042-S form, which we'll talk about very shortly. Then we have things like investment income or gains from selling cryptocurrency. Maybe you went to Vegas at the weekend and did well on the roulette table and had gambling winnings. Or perhaps you had rental income in Philadelphia for more than 14 nights. Maybe you participated in a focus group and received a $200 Amazon gift card for your participation. These are all forms of, generally are going to be taxable and reportable on your US tax return. That leads nicely into income that doesn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. So the first thing I'd talk about here and reiterate is scholarship for tuition and tuition related expenses. So if you've received a taxable scholarship that just covers your tuition, this is generally not taxable and reportable on your US tax return. Similarly, if the scholarship you received came from your home country university or your home country government, this is generally seen as foreign source income and in most cases won't trigger a federal tax reporting requirement. Money transferred from parents or relatives overseas. So this can be quite common. Your friends and family might help with the cost of living in the US and might transfer money over to you. This won't trigger a reporting requirement on your tax return. It's foreign source. It won't have a reporting requirement in the US. Maybe you had income that you earned in your home country. So maybe you had a job in 2024 back at home before you arrived in Philadelphia. And maybe there was rental income or investment income in your home country. In most cases, as a non-resident for tax, your home country income or your foreign source income is not reportable on your tax return. The IRS will only look at your US source income in those cases. If you became a resident for US tax purposes, then that would change and your worldwide income would then be subject to reporting. Finally, interest on a regular savings account. It probably won't even buy us a cup of coffee, unfortunately, but generally it won't trigger a reporting requirement. If you had if you had interest on a high yield savings account or something that was more sophisticated, you might get a 1099 INT to report that interest income. But your bank or your financial institution would usually issue you with an income document if there was tax implications. That leads nicely into the income documents that non-residents may receive at the end of the tax year. So the first is the W-2 form. This reflects wages, salary, compensation from the entire year and the tax that was withheld on that income. So if you had employment in 2024, your employer, whether that's UPenn or your employer outside the university, would issue you with this W-2 form, which you'll need to outline on the Sprintax return software to prepare your tax returns. The second form is the 1042-S form. These forms, we can confirm, have just been released by Penn, which is great. And these would reflect any taxable scholarships, stipends, grants, awards, or if you had income from, let's say, your employment income, maybe part of that was exempt from tax withholding as a result of a tax treaty. That portion that was exempt from tax withholding would be reported on a 1042-S form. So those forms are now available in your Sprintax Calculus account under the 2024 tax forms page. You can give electronic consent there to access that form digitally on your Calculus account if you're expected to receive this form. Finally, the 1099 series reflects less common forms of income like rental income or investment income or work as an independent contractor. So if you did have these types of income, you might get a 1099 form and you can report that income document on Sprintax. So the next topic is non-resident spouses and dependents. So what I often say here is, unfortunately, no matter how long you've been together, no matter how much you love each other, as two non-residents for tax purposes, you cannot file jointly on your US tax return. So you'll be treated separately in the eyes of the IRS. You'll have your own Form 8843 obligations if you were present in the US in 2024 as a non-resident. If you receive taxable US income, you'll also need to file your federal tax return separate of each other, and you'll mail them in separate envelopes. The only way you could file jointly on a US tax return is if you were married to a US resident for tax. So FICA taxes is the next topic of order. And what I'd say here is that this is a tax that is supposed to help you later on in life with the cost of healthcare. It's also better known as Social Security or Medicare tax. But in the eyes of the IRS, I guess, international students and scholars probably won't see the benefit of paying into this tax as you're here temporarily. As a result, non-resident international students and scholars on J1 and F1 visas are exempt from paying FICA tax. Now, it's not a blanket rule. H1B, J2, and TN visa holders are subject to FICA tax from the first day of employment. If you are a resident for tax purposes, this may also change your FICA tax exemption as well. If FICA taxes are withheld in error, the best thing to do is to approach your employer to see if it makes sense for the employer to refund FICA taxes back. If that's not possible, you can prepare a FICA tax claim, and that is Form 843 and 8316. And the Sprintax software can help to prepare a FICA tax claim for you. We also have listed a comparison of the impact of FICA taxes on employees. So you can see, the level of wages here in the top row on this box, and at the bottom, the student portion that could be withheld in error. So obviously, this can be a noticeable amount, which we'd rather in your pockets than in employers' pockets. But again, it's only would, most cases, Penn would be aware of the FICA tax exemption. We often see this happens mostly with, outside contractors that might work with the school. Maybe you're working with a catering company like Aramark, or maybe you are working with an employer outside the university. That's where FICA taxes usually might show up as an issue. Alrighty, so state taxes. There are over 43 states that have state tax laws across the US. Pennsylvania is one of those states that have state tax rules. States across the US have their own tax residency rules. They also have their own filing thresholds. So you could be a non-resident, a part-year resident, or a full-year resident of Pennsylvania, depending on your circumstances. However, in most cases, it's likely that international students and scholars who are not domiciled, they don't have a permanent place of abode in Pennsylvania during the tax year, they're here temporarily for the purposes of study, it's very likely you'll be deemed a non-resident for Pennsylvania state tax purposes. However, this can change, and the Sprintax software will ask questions around your time in the state, the type of accommodation you've been staying in, and more questions around your state obligations to confirm not only your tax residency, as you'll see here, but also whether you've triggered an obligation to file a Pennsylvania state tax return. And as you'll see here, in terms of who needs to file, if you're a resident, non-resident, or part-year resident, you must file a 2024 state return if you received total Pennsylvania gross taxable income in excess of $33 during 2024, even if no tax is due with your Pennsylvania return, and or you incurred a loss from any transaction as an individual, sole proprietor, partner in a partnership, or Pennsylvania S Corp shareholder. It's also important to know on the with regards to local taxes, Philadelphia city wage tax is deducted from your wages. Generally, there is no tax return filing requirement for the city of Philadelphia if no additional city wage tax is due. So the next topic is around the ITIN, which is the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. If you have a social security number, you don't need to worry about this slide. If you just need to file Form 8843 alone, you also don't need to worry about this slide. The ITIN is required mostly for athletes who receive, athletes or full ride scholarship recipients, where they've received taxable scholarship, and as a result, they need to file a federal tax return, but they're not eligible for a social security number. In that case, you might need to apply for an ITIN. And you can apply for an ITIN in advance of your tax return or alongside your tax return during the season. But the rules do change depending which route you take. If you are filing in advance of filing your federal return, you would need to complete and sign Form W7. You might then be able to use a responsible officer who could certify copies of your documents, which would be your passport, visa, and I-20 or DS 2019 for F or J visa holders. You can use also a local IRS office or a certified acceptance agent to have your documents certified instead of using a responsible officer at the school. But if you are using a responsible officer, they would sign a certification letter. So you would need to complete Form W7, sign it, include it with a signed certification letter from the responsible officer, and include it with copies of your visa, passport, and I-20 or DS, and send that to the IRS address. Or if you're using an IRS office or CAA, they'll certify your documents and you can send your W7 alongside that certification. If you're filing alongside the tax return, the rules do change. You cannot have a responsible officer at the school certify your documents. You would need to include a copy of your W7 form signed alongside your 1040NR federal tax return, and you would need to get a copy of your passport certified by a certified acceptance agent or an IRS official. Or if you're back in your home country, you could use your home country issuing passport office or US embassy or consulate to certify a copy of your passport. So it's important to note that. But again, if you have a social security number, you don't need to worry about this slide. And if you just need to file Form 8843, you don't need an ITIN to do that. 1098T then, this is a tuition statement. It's used to claim the educational tax credit, but unfortunately, non-residents for tax purposes cannot claim this credit. Only residents for US tax purposes can. So if you have received a 1098T form, keep it in a safe place, but as a non-resident for tax, you won't need to use it on your tax return. So then we have the golden questions, timelines for a refund. If you filed your tax return and you're now wondering how long does it take to get that back, on the federal side, we'll generally see around 6 weeks, but the IRS would give themselves up to 6 months in the small print before they themselves would start issuing interest on that income, on that refund due back to you. But there is a helpful place where you can check the status of your refund, and that is called irs.gov/where's my refund. This will give you a status of your tax return. Where, is it being processed? Has a refund been issued? So it's a really helpful tool to check the status of your tax returns. Timelines on the state will differ, but it will be fairly similar. Of course, that's going to vary from state to state. So with regards to then cryptocurrency and tax, I suppose generally non-residents would need to report cryptocurrency if you had a taxable event, like converting cryptocurrency to regular currency like US dollars. Maybe you use cryptocurrency to pay for goods or services. Maybe you sold cryptocurrency or received free coins through a fork or an airdrop. And essentially, cryptocurrency is treated as a sale of property, and it's subject to capital gains tax of 30%. So, you'll likely get reporting around your cryptocurrency that you will need to outline on Sprintax. We will ask you if you had cryptocurrency along the journey on the software. So I'm going to launch my next poll now before we jump into this topic, and that is to see whether you think you've ever filed an incorrect tax return in the past. Maybe that's yes, maybe it's no, or maybe you haven't misfiled, but you forgot to file for previous years. I'll let that run for a couple more seconds before we share the results. Okay, great. Wait till we get over 60% of the vote. Great. All right, so 14% of you think you have filed an incorrect return in the past. 23% think you've forgotten to file for previous years. So thanks so much for your feedback there. That leads nicely into this next topic, which is missed a year or filed as a resident by mistake. If you've forgotten to file for previous years or misfiled, don't panic, but do set the record straight. If you've never filed, take that opportunity to catch up. You can backfile at any stage. And what's more, if you're due a refund, the IRS are happy to issue a refund back if it's within the last 3 years. If you misfiled, maybe you use TurboTax by mistake and file as a resident for tax purposes. In that case, you would need to file an amended US tax return, which is called the 1040X form. The good news again is that Sprintax software has the ability to prepare returns for prior years, and we do have an amended tax return service if you need help there as well. And it leads nicely into the implications of not filing. At the end of the day, non-residents are required to comply with all US laws, and that includes your IRS and tax filing obligations, even if that's just Form 8843. So remaining compliant is part of maintaining immigration status in the US, and not filing can affect future immigration status. For example, if you're transitioning to a H-1B visa, or maybe going for a green card, it's likely your tax compliance history will be asked of you if you're going for your green card application. Fines, penalties, and interest can add up if you owe the IRS money, so we don't want that. And you might be due a refund back. The only way that you can get that hard-earned money back into your pocket is by filing a tax return. I would also be very, very careful about options that are being recommended to you. I once was an international student myself. I lived with 3 great American roommates. I would ask them about everyday living in the US all the time. If you're in that same position, just remember that when it comes to taxes, those, your American or resident roommates or work colleagues or friends are treated differently from a tax perspective. They'll need to file using different software, and they'll need to file different tax forms and have different tax rules applied to them. So remember that the likes of TurboTax do not support non-residents for tax purposes. They themselves would be our resident partner, and they would recommend Sprintax for anyone who's unsure whether or not they are a resident or non-resident for tax. So again, follow the information that's coming from the international office at Penn, who recommend Sprintax as an option to file your US tax return. So where can I get my Penn income documents? So firstly, Form W-2. This is your wage and tax statement. So if you were working during 2024 with Penn, you would get your W-2 in Workday, and/or it would have been mailed by January 31st of this year. 1042S form. This form has been issued. It's the foreign person's US source income subject to withholding. This is located in the tax form section on Sprintax Calculus under the 2024 tax year, or it would have been mailed by the March 15th deadline. If you've not received your forms by March 15th, please see finance.upenn.edu. The link is here. And again, the handout is also in your control panel for any of the slides today. So you can access those slides and follow the links here for further instructions. If you received a 1042S from Penn, you may be able to transfer your 1042S information from Calculus to Sprintax returns by using the same email as contained within your Calculus account, or by using the transfer option on your tax forms page on Calculus. Please direct any questions related to W-2 or 1042S forms to the Penn Employee Solution Center. The email for that is here. And if you have questions on the 1098T form, there is a link on the UPenn website for the 1098T. Please note, ISSS does not manage or have access to these documents. If you received income through authorized off-campus employment in 2024, you may receive a tax document from your employer, typically a 1099 or a W-2, and you'll need to follow up with that employer directly to get copies of those income documents. And if you're wondering, what is the difference between Sprintax returns and calculus? So Sprintax calculus is utilized by UPenn to calculate tax withholding and provide participants with necessary tax forms like the Form 1042S where applicable. So it helps the Penn team understand how to tax you correctly during the year on income you receive from the university and issue an important 1042S income document. You may be able to transfer your 1042S form if you've received it from calculus into Sprintax returns. But please note, you will still need to access your code contained within the global.upenn.edu ISSS.IPenn website. This code will be for Sprintax returns, which will cover the cost of your federal tax return on the Sprintax return software. And that software helps to prepare and file your federal and/or state tax returns. It's where you'll be able to upload the information from your W-2 or your 1042S onto the software, and we'll use that to prepare your tax returns for this season. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to outline how you can use the Sprintax returns software to prepare your tax returns, as well as reach out to our support team for questions that you have during the year. So first things first, you will receive instructions. You'll receive an email from the international office with the instructions below. That includes your link to Sprintax and how to access your unique code. So you'll see step one is to create a Sprintax account or log into your Sprintax returns account. Again, if you've got a 1042S form, you can access that and transfer it from your calculus account. You'll complete the Sprintax online questionnaire. So that's the Sprintax return software. And then at the checkout, you'll enter your unique access code on the review your order page. In order to get that code, you will need to log into IPenn. The link is here. You'll need to enter your Penn key and password. Once logged into IPenn, click Taxes on the left menu. Finally, select the subheader Sprintax System to obtain your unique access code for Sprintax, and then you'll utilize Sprintax to finish preparing your return. So the login page is accessible here. This is where you'll be able to access the return software, or you'll be able to transfer directly from calculus. We'll confirm the tax year you need support for. 2024 is the current tax season year. And it's here where we'll confirm your tax residency. So we'll ask you for all of the visits that you've entered in and out of the US and all of the immigration statuses that you were on during that time. And it's here where we'll confirm whether you're a non-resident for tax and can continue through the software, or if you're deemed a resident for tax, we'll stop you here. We'll ask you to double check your information. If you are deemed a resident for tax, then you can indeed file as a tax resident. But most of you will be deemed a non-resident for tax, and you'll be able to continue through the software. We'll then ask what income you've earned during the year, if you have received any US income. If you haven't received any US income, we'll quickly populate the 8843 form for you. If you have received taxable US income, we'll ask you what income documents did you receive, and you can upload copies of your W-2 forms, or if you transferred your 1042S form from calculus, you'll be able to see that transfer available on the system, and you can double check the information that it's valid and correct. Please note there is a live chat option on the bottom right-hand screen of the system. So you'll see above this little X mark, there'll actually be a green chat icon, and that chat icon will give you access to the live chat function, and you will be able to, you'll first arrive at a chat bot, which is AI based, and it will provide helpful articles based on the questions you ask. But if you still need help, you'll be able to say that you didn't get the help you needed from those articles. and you'll be able to then ask for live chat support. You can also type in human agent or live human agent in the chat, and it should direct you to our human chat team. Also note on the W-2 state tax query, so for teaching fellow or research fellows, if you're subject to federal income tax, City of Philadelphia wage tax, but not Pennsylvania personal income tax, blank state wages and state income tax information may indicate other exempt income. So if you're a teaching fellow or research fellow, you'll see this drop down under the W-2, and that may be you may indicate other exempt income here for blank state wages. So again, with state taxes, we'll confirm where you were during the year, what state you were in, the type of accommodation you were staying in. We'll match that with the source of the income from your income documents, and we'll then confirm whether you've triggered not only a Pennsylvania state return, but any state return across the United States. If you'd like to use this for state taxes, you can. It is, of course, a separate fee that you can pay, which is $49.95. So apologies, just to correct this slide, the state return charge is $49.95. But in order to waive the federal tax filing costs, you'll be able to log into ITIN with your Penn key and password. Once logged into ITIN, click Taxes on the left menu. Finally, select the subheader Sprintax System to obtain your unique access code for Sprintax, and then enter that code here, and it will waive the full cost of your federal return fees. So again, it's a great benefit for you to use, so definitely go ahead and do that, especially now that all of the income documents have been released. There's no stopping you from starting the process of completing your taxes now. I also want to note that e-filing is now available for federal tax returns. So the option to e-file is here for federal returns. If you are eligible to e-file your tax return, you'll see this blue option, the proceed to e-file box, and you can continue to e-file your federal return. I would recommend to just double check that your e-file submission is accepted by the IRS. They will, double check the information you've submitted, like your tax number, like the information from your W-2. If something doesn't match, they can reject it. And if they do, you'll need to print, sign, and mail your return. But there will be confirmation on the Sprintax software, and you'll get it by email to confirm if your e-file was successful. If you don't see this e-file option here, it's likely that you're not eligible to do so or to e-file. And you will see it below the option to download your federal tax return pack and your state return pack, which will have full instructions on where to mail your return, that you'll need to print, sign, and mail it. It will also let you know what income documents you'll need to include with your tax return to submit to the tax authorities. Do also note that state tax returns and Form 8843 alone will still need to be printed, signed, and mailed to the tax authorities. In terms of other support then that are helpful and on hand, we've got lots of educational videos on our YouTube channel that are there to guide you through the process. We've got blog content for tax awareness there as well. So if you need to do some additional reading, there's international student tax guides on all things non-resident tax there for you. The 24/7 live chat team is there on hand to help with your tax questions. Please note, the international office cannot give tax advice, so please direct any questions that you have along the journey to our live chat team. And then we'll have lots more open workshops and webinars just like today's session throughout the season for you to get a refresher on your tax obligations. Great, so that covers the informational section of this webinar. We are going to cover now look at some Q&A that's been coming through in the back end. Hopefully you found this session to be helpful. I know taxes can be daunting. I was there myself many, many years ago as an international student, but hopefully this helps to put your mind at ease a little bit. And the Sprintax software is going to be there to guide you through the process and help you along the way. So really appreciate all of you tuning in today, and we will look at some questions that have been coming through on the back end now.
I can jump in here, Ryan, while you catch your breath going through a lot of the slides and lots of great information. Thanks everyone for the questions on the back end. Definitely a couple of common themes that are popping up, so might look to address those first. There are a lot of questions around, if you're here for 6 years, should you be using Sprintax? Should you be using a resident provider? We'd always say typically the easiest way to figure out your residency for tax purposes is on Sprintax returns. Complete step 1 residency. If you're a non-resident, it will simply let you continue to the next step. But if you have been here long enough to be deemed a resident for tax purposes, the system will let you know, stop you, and point you in the direction of TurboTax to file a resident tax return. Also, a good few people who are maybe earning income in multiple states, lots of questions around state tax filing requirements. Do you need to file for one or multiple states? Again, this can depend a lot on your personal circumstances and the specific state. So on the Sprintax return system, if you provide all of your accurate information, enter all of your income documents on the one account, the system will be able to figure out your tax filing requirements on the federal and the state side for one or multiple states, and will let you know if you need to file for more than one state.
Yeah, lots of interesting questions coming through. If I missed filing for taxes for previous years, can I use Sprintax to do that? Yes, so you can backfile for prior years. Do note that the code will only be active and available for 2024. So I recommend filing and getting the benefit from your tax return for 2024, and then you do have the option on Sprintax to backfile for prior years. Lots of you with maybe dependents, or maybe your wife holds, a J2 wife or husband holds J2 visa. They don't have any US income, but they were present in the US during 2024. They will likely need to file Form 8843 if they're non-resident for tax. And if they earned any US income, they'd also need to file a federal tax return. You can add a dependent Form 8843 along the way on Sprintax if you had, a spouse or a child that you needed to file a Form 8843 form for. Then I do see questions around tax treaty benefits. How do I know if I'm eligible for a treaty benefit? So when you are going through the Sprintax return software, firstly, make sure to input your immigration status correctly. For example, if Ryan's a J1 visa holder, it's important that you outline your correct J1 visa category as per box 4 of your DS 2019, i.e., J1 researcher, J1 student, J1 professor, for example. That's really important. Also double check your income information, and Sprintax will let you know if you are treaty eligible depending on your circumstances.
Yeah, still some questions around maybe backfiling. Someone who was here in September 2023 only for 4 months and didn't earn any income, do they need to file a return for 2023? So if you were present in the tax year as a non-resident on an F, J, M or Q visa, you would need to file Form 8843. And if you didn't earn any income, then that's the primary form that you would need to file. Questions around refunds as well. As an international student, can we receive money back? In that case, can we file employment and scholarship together? So firstly, if you receive income from multiple sources during the tax year, all will need to be reported on your one tax return. So whether that's employment, scholarship, or otherwise, you'll report that all on Sprintax on your one return. And then when it comes to refunds, that will depend on your personal circumstances. So you'll be due a refund if you overpaid tax during the tax year. So perhaps if maybe you were tax treaty eligible and you didn't claim that at the point of payment, you may be due a tax refund. Then a couple of questions around a resident filing. So does a resident need to file Form 1042S? It's a good question. If you do receive a 1042S and you are actually a resident alien for tax purposes, you will still need to report that on your resident return. And TurboTax do have a resource. If you simply Google TurboTax and reporting your 1042S, they have help articles up there on exactly how to input your 1042S into TurboTax.
Yeah. What is the status of J1 postdoc? So just depends on, I suppose, again, look at your box 4 of your DS 2019. If you're J1 student, you're given 5 years non-resident status. If you were a J1 researcher, short-term scholar, professor, intern, this would be 2 years out of the last 6 calendar years where you're treated as a non-resident for tax purposes. Someone getting 1099 forms, got a 1099 INT, you might have had a high yield interest account. You will need to report that as an income document on Sprintax returns. Again, if you earned any taxable US income in the US, you would need to file a 1040NR, which is the federal tax return forms. The section 2024 W2 and earning summary on my W2 form is empty. I only earned a small amount of income. Do you know why that section is blank? I probably can't give you the answer there. I will highlight, however, the section where if you have questions on your Penn income documents, where you can reach out as well, just so everyone who might still have questions there. If you have any questions on your W2 or 1042S, the Penn Employee Solution Center is the best place to go, which is solutioncenter@upenn.edu, or there's a phone number there as well.
Yeah, there's still maybe it's a couple of questions around refunds, people who, think they shouldn't have been paying tax and they're wondering how do they get that back. So really the only opportunity to reclaim overpaid tax is through filing a compliant tax return. So you'll need to file a return either way if you trigger a filing requirement, but if you're due a refund, Sprintax will give you a refund summary and give you routes that you can decide to receive that, whether it's through a US bank account, through a check, or credit it to the following tax year as well. And then there's still some questions, like I moved to the US in November 23. I'd like to ask if I will be considered a resident from 2025. So again, as Ryan touched on, it will depend. Like if you're an F1 or J1 student, you're generally given 5 calendar years of non-resident status. If you're a J1 researcher or scholar, for example, you're generally given 2 calendar years. So it's after those years that are used up, your days start counting towards the substantial presence test. So completing that first step on Sprintax is definitely the easiest route to go down. You won't make any payment or enter any code to complete that step. And if you are a resident, the system will inform you of such.
Yeah, a lot of you may be getting, again, 1099 forms. If you did receive these, you can outline them on the Sprintax system. 1095B or 1095C forms, you don't need these on Sprintax. They are healthcare coverage forms, but you cannot use those to claim the premium tax credit. Then just looking to see any other questions here. Are those F1 5 calendar years only for the time in which you're an F1 visa? I'm on a 3-year program, then we'll be getting another form of visa when I start working. So the 5-year calendar rule is for F1 or J1 student visas. So if you are, you don't need to be present for the entire year. So the IRS will say, if Ryan is an F1 or J1 student, we'll give him a 5-year lifetime rule, where if he's an F1 student, if he's present in the US at any point during a year, that he won't count those days towards the substantial presence test. So, if you're 3 years in on your student visa, it's likely you're considered a non-resident for tax. If you're getting another form of visa, I can't tell you, when you are on that status, depending on what it is, you could transition to a resident for tax purposes. If it's another student visa, you may still have another 2 years left being a non-resident for tax.
Yeah, someone, I can't find the backfile option on the Sprintax website. Can you instruct me? Yeah, absolutely. So once you log into Sprintax, the first screen you'll see is a list of tax years. So online, we can help with backfiling for the prior 3 years. So you'll select the relevant tax year and then essentially move to the following step and complete that questionnaire. If you need help further back than what's available online, you can select that option at the bottom of the screen and our support team will reach out to assist you with that offline. And then people looking to file from way back in 2014, we'd be likely able to assist with that offline if you trigger a filing requirement. Let's see here.
Great. My ITIN number isn't written on my 1042S, but when completing the data on Sprintax returns, my ITIN is automatically written. So do I remove it, like the way that it's in the 1042S, or do I keep it? So we collect the tax number before we ask for the income document. So it's okay if it's not on the income document that you're uploading. We will report your tax number on the actual tax return. So you can continue through the process there. I know we're coming up on time. I see a few more questions on backfiling. So again, when you're going through Sprintax, you can select prior tax years like 2023, 22, or 21. Should I use my UPenn email for backfiling? You know, I would, if you're set up on Calculus, then I would recommend using the email on your Calculus account because it will transfer your record across. So most likely that is your UPenn email address. Great. Lots of questions, lots of attendees, which is fantastic. Again, what I would say is the income documents have been released by Penn, W-2s and 1042S forms. So if you're ready to file, don't wait until April 15th. You'll save yourself a lot of stress and hassle by filing now, well in advance of that date. But we hope you really got helpful information today, and we'd like to wish you all the very best of luck with your tax filing obligations this season.
Thanks for joining, everyone, and hope you have a nice weekend.
Take care.